time. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Emma Stone from the University of Bristol. And this, by the way, this afternoon's session, the first part of it is on the environment and astronomy. And Emma's talk is Shedding Light on Bat Behaviour, How Street Lights Disturb Commuting Bats. So over to Emma, whom I can't see, but
I'm here.
Right, there we go. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you can't really see much. Can everybody hear me with this mic here if I walk away? Is it doing its job? Good. Thanks very much for the introduction. I don't quite know how I'm going to top that, but I'll do my best. As Terry said, I'd like to speak to you today about my PhD project, not quite a doctor yet, but getting there, looking at the impact of street lighting on commuting and foraging behaviour of bats. So I'll basically start with a bit of project background, go through my aims and methods that I've undertaken in the last couple of years, and mainly focus on my findings and a summary of what I'm planning to do in the next year or two. So we'll start with some very familiar pictures, and we've all seen this already today. And, you know, it's not going to take much convincing, I'm sure, of everyone here to sort of identify the fact that light pollution is a huge problem. It's widespread and it's globally increasing, inhabiting every continent. And this map of Europe shows you that there's pretty much nowhere that's unaffected. And again, very familiar pictures, sorry for the repetition. When we look closer to home, it's a very similar picture. And over that 7-year period, between 93 and 2000, there was a 24% increase in light pollution in England alone, and that's quite substantial. So you can see, again, there's hardly any areas that are unaffected. So it is a global and increasing problem. And in the UK, it falls under that new legislation, the Clean Neighbourhoods and Environment Bill 2005. However, a recent report by the ILE has outlined lots of problems with this bill. The biggest problem, really, especially where I'm concerned in my research, is that street lighting is largely excluded from this bill and has very little control in terms of pollution associated with it. In addition to that, anything relating to transport facilities, so that's your harbours and all of your airports and all of the horrible metal halide lights that they use in their car parks, again, are uncontrolled and not part of this bill either. So it's pretty much unregulated in terms of the environment in the UK. And if you add to that the fact that there are no established protocols currently identifying when and indeed how to mitigate the effects of light pollution on the environment and wildlife in general, and add to that, where bats are concerned, that their habitat is not actually protected unless they happen to be roosting or foraging in an area that is already protected, so an existing national park or SSSI, something like that. So, but just because the bats are there, even though they're protected, the habitat isn't. So as soon as they leave their roost, they come under the risk of all the impacts of environmental pollution and light pollution particularly. So it paints a pretty grim picture, really. Unregulated, we don't really know what to do with it, and that habitat is unprotected. So what are the impacts of light pollution, the ecological impacts that we're aware of? Well, as the next speaker is going to go into, there are lots of studies that have been done on a variety of species, from the smallest insects being attracted to lights to turtles being dazzled on their nesting beaches. But in terms of bats, surprisingly, even though they're a nocturnal species, we know very little about the impacts of light pollution on bats. But we do know some things. What we know about streetlights is that there are some species that are attracted to lights. And these species have been found to be generally the most common species in the country concerned. So in the UK, you're looking at common pipistrelle bats. Also, there's other species, the larger species of bats, so your ceratines and your nocturals, they've been shown to be attracted to some lights. So we know that there's an attractive effect there. In terms of light types, we only really know anything about white lights. Those are the ones that have been mostly studied. And again, they've been shown to be attractive to insects and therefore to bats. And there's been a high correlation with the UV content of light. So high UV means high numbers of insects, which in turn means high numbers of bats. But again, only of certain species, not of all species. So that's quite clear with white lights. But what we don't know is anything about most other types of lights. The picture with sodium lights and discharge lamps is not very clear. We know nothing about the effects of high-pressure sodium lights on bats. And that's quite important, considering that high-pressure sodium lights are the most dominant street light in the UK at the moment. Although they're not being replaced like for like anymore, they're still out there in the environment and they're having substantial impacts, and we don't know what those impacts are. In addition to that, we only really know, as I said, about a very few species. We only know about common pipistrelles, ceratines and nocturals. We've got some idea about myotis bats, But all the other species, which happen to coincidentally be a lot of the rarer and threatened species, we don't really know anything about. So that's really where my focal species comes in. So I'd just like to introduce you to the lesser horseshoe bat, if you don't already know, haven't met them yet. This is a very small threatened bat, listed by IUCN as vulnerable. They only weigh about 9 grams, about the size of a plum. And they're protected like all the bat species in the UK. We have 17 species, all of them are protected under UK and EU level legislation. So, there's quite a lot of interest in these species. We have an estimated population at the moment of around about 50,000 in the UK, about 28,000 of which are in Wales. And so we've got pretty much a European stronghold for this species. They're at the northern limit of their European distribution, and they're very much restricted within the UK. We only really find them in parts of Ireland, in Wales and southwest England. They only go as far as east as Dorset. And in the last couple of decades, there's been massive, substantial declines in the population throughout Europe. So we hold quite an important population of this species. They're a very interesting bat because they're quite particular. There's only 2 types of horseshoe bats in the UK, and obviously this is one of them. It's the smaller one. They live in maternity roosts in the summer where the females gather to give birth, and they live generally in buildings and caves and houses. And the maternity roosts can number, on average, about 70 individuals, but it can reach into the hundreds. Some roosts, largest roosts, around about 600, but that's quite rare. And they're quite particular bats. They've got very specific echolocation calls adapted for foraging in cluttered environments. So they're really a woodland bat. Although they live in buildings, they leave the roost every evening and forage into woodlands. And because they're quite small, and they're also relatively slow flying compared to other species, and they fly really low to the ground. They only fly up to about 5 metres, so they just come straight past your head. They're not like the bigger bats which fly really high. Because of this, they exhibit what I like to call hedge-hugging behaviour. So they basically like to follow linear features to navigate their way through the landscape. And it's generally predicted that they do this to avoid predation by aerial predators, so things like sparrowhawks and owls, and obviously cats, which can take them out of the air. And because they're quite slow and they fly low, they like to stick to these hedges and walls just to protect themselves from wind and rain and mainly predators. So this reliance on these linear features is one of the reasons why I predicted that there would be a negative impact of light pollution along these commuting routes for this species. They're very particular. So, going on to my aims, the general aim of my project really is to look at the impact of lighting on bat activity and species diversity, focusing on these commuting routes, because these commuting routes are very important for the survival of species within the landscape as a whole. And at the moment, the whole movement in conservation biology is going away from species-based approach towards an ecosystem-level approach. And so understanding what happens when you fragment that landscape is a really important part of the survival of these species. So I'm focusing on these commuting routes, and particularly what I'm doing is looking at bat activity and species diversity using a before and after approach, using these light experiments that I do with my portable street lights, which has never been done before. So it's quite a novel technique where I take the light pollution to the bats. And the ultimate idea really is to develop evidence-based guidelines for people who are working in the environment affected by light pollution, so consultants, engineers, developers, those type of people. So I've been going about, in the last couple of years, been doing light experiments every summer during the maternity period, and I also do emergence counts, counting the bats as they emerge from the roost and taking light levels to get an understanding of what they normally emerge in terms of light levels. So starting with the experiments, I basically selected maternity sites, so roosts that are generally in buildings, with more than 40 bats, which allows me to have just enough information to deal with, enough bat activity to play with. And the most important thing about these sites was that they obviously had these linear commuting routes within the vicinity of the roost that the bats would be using, and on top of that, that I could actually get access to with my ridiculously oversized equipment, which you'll see in a minute. So once I identified these suitable sites, I then went about identifying the flight paths that were used by the bats. So I had to select my hedgerows for the experiment, and I did this using anabat detectors. And these are remote acoustic detectors which you install at the hedgerow. You can leave it overnight. And what they do is they just record the echolocation calls of the bats as they fly by. And I can then analyse that on some software and identify which species have flown by at what time, how many times they flew by. So I can get an idea of relative bat activity, so it's kind of an index of activity. And so I do this at all my sites and identify like the most active hedge, their favoured hedge, and I simply chose that for my experiment. So once I basically started my experiment, I had to use all my lighting equipment. So here's just to give you an idea of what I was trying to do. So you can see the two lighting towers. I had two portable lighting units. And on top of those, I've got standard UK street lights, high-pressure sodium lights for the ones that I tested. This was in last season. This season I tested LED street lights, but I'm not going to tell you about the results of that as yet. In fact, you can see the picture I've got up there, that's LED lights. That's the ones I did this summer, and these are the ones I did last year. But those street lights were donated from a lighting company, professional lighting company, DW Windsor. So they are the standard street lights that are being sold at the moment and used on the streets. So I wanted to make sure that I closely matched what's going on in the natural environment. Well, not so natural. And so they were powered on site by a portable generator, which was the most silent one I could get on the market. And obviously I had to tow it all around with my trailer and Land Rover throughout the summer. So at each site we spent about 7 nights through the process of the experiment. And it started with a control night on the first night, which basically was all the detectors installed, no disturbance from me. So it's your baseline bat activity, what the bats would normally be doing without me messing up their daily lives. And the second night was the noise night, and this was just a control, really, for the effects of noise, because I had to differentiate between disturbance due to noise from the generator and presence of the equipment and disturbance from the light itself. So that was to control for that. And then the subsequent 4 nights were the lit treatment. So the lights were switched on half an hour before sunset, as a standard street light would, left all night running, and then switched off in the morning. And then finally I had a repeat of the noise just to see if the bats would respond differently when it was switched off again. So that's my lighting experiment. So into the results. Last year I did a total of 8 sites through the maternity period, May through July. And you can see they were located all the way from North Wales, quite a big roost up here, down through Mid Wales, Gloucestershire, Somerset, Devon, and finally down in Cornwall. And at each site, generator was placed around about 60 metres from the hedge, and the hedge was generally about 120 metres from the roost, so it's quite local. So starting with the emergence counts, and so you can see here, this is just a frequency histogram of the light levels during emergence, measured in lux, against the frequency of observed bats. So that's, you can effectively take that as number of bats. And basically what you can see here is that bats were emerging around about 5 lux. So that's the sort of median bat emergence lux level. And they were emerging on average about 34 minutes after sunset, which is kind of standard for this species. So this is to really give you a bit of context of the light levels that the bats are used to flying in. So what does 5 lux mean? It's quite difficult to imagine 5 lux and even to describe it to someone. So to put it into a bit of context, if you were to take your average overcast night, it would be down here way off the bottom of the scale at 0.0002. And in contrast, if you were to take a bright sunlit day, it's way off the scale at 103,000 lux, and our bats are down here at around about 5, and that's on emergence, so to give you a bit of context. And during my experiments, I also measured light levels along hedgerows on dark nights, so where they would normally fly along the hedge and commute along it. Right at the hedge, I took the light levels, and along those hedges, it was just under half a lux, so 0.45, whereas in the middle of the field, your ambient light levels during the same nights was 1.25, significantly higher. And just as a note, that area there, the ambient light, was measured in the middle of the fields, and that's where the species that I was talking about earlier that are attracted to lights, the pipistrelle bats, the ceratines and the nocturals, that's where they forage, that's where they spend most of their time. They fly out in the middle of the fields, whereas our friendly horseshoe bats are sticking quite closely to the hedge down at 0.45. So that just gives you a little bit of context. And then prior to me doing my experiments, I did some not as intricately as Andreas did. I actually went out and did some pollution surveys where I got out of the car and measured lux levels at hedgerows along sort of streets around the Bristol area and suburban areas. And I found an average of around about 52 lux on high-pressure sodium lit streets at the hedgerow. And so I was trying to replicate this during my experiment, and I managed to do so. And there's my distribution of lux levels on my experimental hedge. So I got around about 53 lux on my lit nights across sites. So that's to give you an idea of what's happening. They're emerging at about 5, commuting at half a lux, and I'm about to blast them with 53 lux. So you can kind of guess what's going to happen.
Are these all bats or only your own species?
It's all species. This is, well, the results I'm talking about today is just for lesser horseshoe bats, but I have done analysis on all the other species as well, but that's like a whole nother presentation.
These are only lesser horseshoes?
What I'm talking about today, yeah, is the results from lesser horseshoes, yeah. Okay, so that's what was about to happen. So what I did was I took the results across sites, pulled them, and tested the effective treatment type against bat activity across nights, basically. Across sites, sorry. So I just put them into a repeated measures ANOVA, and you can see here, so along the bottom you've got the treatment type, so that's the type 1, which is control, then second night noise, then all the lit nights, and then the repeat of the noise. And on the y-axis we've just got mean bat passes, so that's your activity, number of bats effectively. Well, not number of bats, but you can think of it like that. So on the first night in control, baseline activity was just under 80 bat passes, and then it dropped slightly on the noise night, just under 60. And then you can see a much more substantial drop on the lit night to under 10 bat passes. And it stays low and, in fact, gets lower towards the end of the lit treatment sequence. And then finally on the noise night, it rises up again to just below what it was before on the previous noise. So just by eyeballing that, you can see there's something going on. And most importantly, when I did the analysis and did the post-hocs, what I found was, even though it appears that they didn't like the noise, because you've got a drop on both noise nights compared to control, those were still within the variation of the control night. So there was no significant difference, actually, between the noise nights and the control. So effectively, there was no real effect of noise during this experiment. It may look that way, but statistically, there's no difference. And most importantly, when I tested the lit nights against the controls, including the noise, there was a significant difference. So there was a significant effect of light on bat activity. And obviously, that was a negative effect because they've reduced in number. So what was also interesting is that I decided to test between the lit nights, so testing each treatment against each other, and what I found, there was no significant difference. And that's quite interesting because it kind of implies, even though a short period of 4 days, it kind of implies that there's no evidence for habituation. The bats weren't getting used to the lights over time, which a lot of people seem to suggest. Because if they were getting used to it, I would kind of expect maybe a slight increase on lit 3 or even lit 4, and maybe at least lit 4 to be different to one of the other lit treatments, but that wasn't the case at all. In fact, it reduced even further on lit 3 and lit 4, so if anything, it's the opposite. But again, we need to do further habituation studies over longer time periods to see what's going on. But the main take-home message really is that light has a negative effect on bat activity overall across sites for lesser horseshoe bats. So what about commencement of activity, timing of activity? So I ran some analysis looking at the time that the bats flew along the hedge. So I've measured that in minutes after sunset on the y-axis there, and you've got your standard treatments along the bottom, and I've just pulled the lit nights due to lack of degrees of freedom across sites because I had less sites where this information was gathered. So again, I ran it through an ANOVA to see whether there was an effective treatment type on time of commuting, or minutes after sunset. And what was quite interesting is that you can see there on the lit treatment, there was a significant delay in the time that they commuted along the hedgerow. So whereas under control, normal conditions, they would reach the hedgerow and commute along it about half an hour after sunset, just after emergence. During the lit nights, that was substantially delayed. Almost 80 minutes after sunset, they got to commute along the hedgerow. And that's quite an important thing because bats emerge and their timing of emergence has been studied quite comprehensively. And if they're delayed in times of emergence and reaching their foraging grounds, then they miss the opportunity in the peak in abundance in insects at that time. There's a massive peak at dawn and dusk. And if they're delayed in any way, they're going to miss valuable foraging opportunities. And at this time of year, in summer, where they're just about to give birth, that can have serious consequences for the survival of the colony. So that was quite an important find. The take-home message, light delays the onset of commuting activity. So this leads us. So basically, we know that activity overall is reduced and the timing of activity is delayed. So straight away it leads you to think, well, what are they doing? Where are the bats going? What's happening? So I basically came up with 4 ideas as to what I think could happen, what the choices the bats have. And the first one is obviously they could choose to fly high above or around the lights, thus avoiding detection. However, during my experiments, I did behavioural observations on all lit treatment nights just to make sure this wasn't happening. And only 2% of bats that did that as a response. So you can pretty much discount that as the main response of the colony as a whole. Alternatively, they could switch and fly on the dark side of the hedge in response to the disturbance on their preferred side of the hedge, which would seem the most suitable solution. And during my experiments, I also had detectors on the dark side of the hedge to test for this. And I did the same sort of thing. So it's a familiar graph again there. You've got the treatment along the bottom with the lit nights pulled, and you've got number of bat passes, activity along the Y. And when I ran this through the analysis, there was no significant effect of treatment type on activity. So effectively, I would have expected, if they were flying on the dark side of the hedge, would be an increase on the lit night, because they've reduced on the lit night on the other side, so they're flying to the dark side. So it should be a significant increase, but that wasn't the case. So we can pretty much discount that for the main response of the bats to avoiding this light disturbance. So what are we left with? Well, obviously, they could return to the roost and just get the hump and not go out at all. But that's pretty much unlikely. At this time of year, they are basically building up reserves. They're about to give birth. They're heavily pregnant. They need to go and feed. To stay in the roost all night would have serious fitness consequences. They may do it for one night even, but it's very unlikely that they would do it repeatedly because it just is not good for their survival. So pretty much biological reasoning tells us that's not going to be the response. So what we're left with really is that they've chosen an alternative route, and that's basically what I'm plumbing for. So given the fact that if we go with that, they've chosen an alternative route, who cares? So what? Why are we bothered about it? Why am I standing here nattering on about bats going down a different hedge? Who cares? Well, there's lots of consequences of route switching, and most of these are related to fitness. And hopefully what I'll be able to convince you is that most of these are quite negative, which is quite worrying. So there's lots of potential fitness costs of route switching, and all of these costs are really much dependent on a site-by-site basis on the availability and quality of alternative routes that they choose to fly down. So at each site, these alternative routes could vary in terms of availability. So they may have a reduced choice, so there's only one or two other routes that they can take. So you've got to remember, these bats will not fly across open areas. They will not. They will only fly along, very rarely. They have to fly along protected areas. Or there could be no choice at all. So there's no other route for them to take. So what happens then? Well, in a worst-case scenario, it could be that that actual roost then becomes suboptimal for that species. It can't reach its foraging area. So it's effectively been cut off from the foraging ground. And what would happen, really, is that they would just switch to another roost. So they'd abandon that roost and find somewhere else. And that's clearly not what we want to happen, given the fact that roosts are actually declining in numbers in the UK, the availability of roosts is declining. So, obviously that's a worst-case scenario which we're trying to avoid. But perhaps most likely is that the alternative roosts will vary heavily in terms of quality. So they can vary in terms of distance to foraging area. So the bats may be forced to fly further through the landscape to reach their foraging ground. And you may ask, well, so what? Well, actually, there's quite a lot of studies, a few studies that have shown that this can be quite important for bats in terms of the energetics costs of flying through the landscape. So there's one study that was conducted with myotis bats that found that where the distance between the roost and the foraging areas increased, it resulted in reduced juvenile growth rates. So the babies weren't as big and weren't as healthy, and that has long-term knock-on effects for the colony and survival of the species. So that's obviously quite concerning. And studies of pipistrelles in the UK also found a threshold distance above which the bats no longer foraged. They didn't go and commute down that route because it wasn't energetically cost-effective to do so. So this may be the case for lesser horseshoe bats. There may be a distance, say 2 kilometres, beyond which it's not worth them flying down there because they can't offset the cost of that long flight by feeding during the foraging time. So distance to foraging area is quite a significant issue. But also, the alternative routes might vary in terms of cover, and this is what the big issue is with this species. People predict that's why they choose to use linear features. So they could vary, they could be more exposed. So this route here, which is down in Somerset, this is at one of my sites, and not one bat used this hedge during the whole 2-week period that I was there. And, it's pretty obvious why. It's heavily clipped. And we know from studies of energetics of bats that increased wind and rain has lots of energetics cost for the bats. So, if you're exposing them to the elements more, it's going to cost them energetically more. So that's going to have knock-on effects for the colony. And also, if they're more exposed, especially for this species, again, like I said, being very small, a slow flyer, flying low to the ground, you're going to increase the risk of predation, which obviously increases the chances of mortality for the colony. And they only give birth to one young a year. So, it's quite significant. If something like that happens and knocks out a large number of the individuals, it's going to take them a long time to recover from that. They're not like rabbits. So, in summary, this is last year's work. I've been able to provide the first empirical evidence of a negative impact of lighting on bats, and particularly high-pressure sodium lighting on lesser horseshoe bats. And I've been able to show that lighting alters commuting behaviour, and it does this through delaying the onset or the timing of commuting, and also by causing avoidance behaviour and potentially route switching. And also, I've basically been able to show that lighting can fragment commuting routes. It can fragment the landscape for these bats, and it may force them to use these suboptimal routes, which have potential fitness and energetic costs, which long-term can affect the survival of the species within the landscape. So that's basically what I've done with lesser horseshoe bats. And I just wanted to say, before I finish, we've talked a lot about LEDs, well, I haven't, everyone else has talked a lot about LEDs today, and I've kind of got my finger on that pulse as well. And so this summer just finished, I just did a whole load of experiments just working with LED lights, the intelligent ones where I used a laptop and sat in the Land Rover and switched them on, which was quite neat. So, watch this space, because that's those data are being analysed. I'm going through them at the moment. So hopefully I'll be able to add to this with the LEDs before they start putting all over the country. I wanted to try and get some idea on how they're going to impact bats before they start, installing them everywhere. So yeah, I'll keep my eye on that one. So that just leaves me to thank my supervisors, Gareth and Steve, my field assistants, Tom Webster from ILE, Carol from BCT, of course all the site owners who let me camp on their site for a week at a time, back group members. There's so many people to thank, it's just crazy, and all of my funders, which there's way too many, and, well, never enough actually. And just a little plug at the end for our new website, which we've just set up. So we've got quite a lot of information on there about bats and some of the papers that we've written. And also, hopefully, we'll have a lot more information about lighting on there soon as well. Thanks very much. Any problem?
Excellent, and well within schedule.
Oh, good.
I would take questions as long as they're none about Batwoman or Batman, for that matter.
Or Robin.
So, all right, John, I saw your hand. Maybe you weren't first, but I'll move away from the lights.
Can't really see.
Go ahead.
The two things you found on the lit nights, one, they go out 80 minutes on average later instead of 34 minutes after sunset, and they choose a different route. Are they waiting for that other 50 minutes, hoping the light is going to go off? In other words, are they coming out, seeing it and going back, and then saying, I've waited long enough, now I'm going to choose an alternative route? Is that what they're doing, do you think?
No. What a lot of the behavioural observations, which I didn't have time to put in, they get very confused, actually. They were emerging at 34 minutes after sunset, but it's the commuting time that was delayed, so the time they hit the hedge and go along it. So they're still emerging the same, but what happens is when they reach the hedge, some of them start flying around in circles, getting very confused. And some of them fly on the other side, then fly back, and there's all sorts of strange behaviour going on. Obviously, some do fly through, but the majority of them are turning around, heading off another way. And once they've headed off, it's very difficult for me to actually see behaviourally where they've gone. I did have detectors on all the other hedgerows, but it took me 3 months to analyse the acoustics for that one experiment. So, those other hedgerows are just going to have to wait, I think.
But wasting energy and wasting time.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're forcing them down potentially suboptimal routes at the energetic cost to them. So, yeah.
Robert there, really interesting research and well presented. Very good.
Thank you.
A question regarding the animator that you're testing the echolocation. Probably I'd be right in saying, I don't know much about bats, but different species have different frequencies.
That's right. Yeah.
Within the species, can you detect if it's a different bat?
Well, you can. Certain individuals will echolocate at slightly different frequencies. Yeah, we know that happens. But it's not diagnostic. It's not something that I can use to say number of bats. So the only real safe way of estimating it is an index of relative activity. I can't really be sure to say that, because they also vary their echolocation calls depending on the environment. So it's quite a bit of a nightmare, really.
I think there's one at the back there first.
You made the comparison between the dark side of the hedge and the lit side.
difference in lighting on both sides?
There was.
I saw your picture of the installation.
Yeah.
The lamp was well above the edge, so a lot of the light would come on the other side as well.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, it's around about, I think from memory, about 13 lux on the dark side, so it wasn't particularly dark. On dark nights, it was just under half a lux, like I said. So it was statistically higher, so there was still light spill on that side of the hedge. So yeah, that's my explanation as to why they probably didn't, majority of the bats didn't choose that as the response. But effectively, that I was trying to replicate what happens in the environment, and that would happen naturally. There would be spill. Although with the LEDs, as you can see there, they got really good back cut-off, and so there's hardly any spill on the dark side on those experiments. And I haven't been able to analyse it yet, but I'm predicting really that they might just switch to that side. But I don't know. Don't quote me on that. Haven't finished it yet.
I think just one more quick question and hopefully a quick answer, please. Why high pressure sodium? Is there any reason? I think we've often led to believe that bats are blind, as blind as a bat, so why, is there any particular frequency of light that might be significant?
Well, two parts to that question. Bats aren't blind. In fact, their vision is quite substantially better than ours at lower light levels. And there's been lots of experiments that have shown that vision is very important to them in terms of foraging and sort of navigating through the landscape, especially in terms of foraging. So that's one aspect. But in terms of the HPS, I chose them because they're the most dominant light type and because nothing's been done. And so it's just crying out, really, for someone to answer that question, because most of our lighting is high-pressure sodium, and we have no idea how it impacts species other than those that are attracted to it. So that was the reason, really. And in terms of wavelengths and bats, we don't really know that much about what they can see and what they can't see. There's been a couple of theses done on bat vision, but it's only on a few species. And the responses and the spectral response of the bat eye varies very much from species to species. So it's, what applies to one bat is not going to apply necessarily to others. So I don't think you're ever going to find a truly bat-friendly light type by using a colour, you know. But people do use red lights when they go into roost because it's less obtrusive, whether that's due to the spectral content or whether it is actually due to the fact that because it's red, it's not as bright. So I don't know. That's kind of again open in terms of that, but that's why I chose high pressure.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, could you make it very quick, please?
Yes. What about the beneficial aspect of bats eating insects? The farms, for example, in many areas of the world rely on bats to remove insects from their orchards and bats.
Yeah.
And now if they're starting to put up these illumination lights on the farms, that possibly will affect the beneficial aspects of the bats eating.
Well, that's kind of debatable. There's a bit of a debate in the bat community about. There's some people who think that lighting's okay for bats because, you know, these species are attracted and forage around them, and they almost have a street light each and stuff. And, you know, that's great for them because they've got increased foraging opportunities. And then there's other people who think completely the opposite, that actually it's really bad for insects and the ecosystem as a whole because you're attracting insects away from the woodland where other species who can't benefit from this exposed environment are now having their prey source depleted. So although it could be used as a tool, like you say, to reduce insect numbers, whether they would be reducing the right type of insects, because bats are very particular about what they eat. They won't just eat everything, and they all got different niche separations. So whether that would work anyway, I don't know. But, you know, the overall wider impacts of lighting on the landscape as a whole, rather than just a bat, I think is something that is more important, really, that we need to understand the impacts on the whole ecosystem. You know, rather than just benefiting one bat species, it should be not necessarily benefiting, but definitely not be detrimental to the whole ecosystem.
Okay, we'll have to finish it there. Fascinating discussion following up on that. So obviously a very interesting subject. Thank you very much indeed. Okay.
There you go.
Thank you. Thanks, Emma.